Good evening, everybody. This is take two. We're going to try again for 2020 high school graduates with LD and ADHD and emerging adulthood. For those of you watching this recording on YouTube, don't worry about what happened. It's all fine. We're having some technical difficulties. It's good to know that no matter how old you are, you still have lots of things to learn. So just a little bit of housekeeping for those attending live. Please turn off your cameras, mute your mics. If you want to rename yourself, this is being recorded and will be on my YouTube channel. You can now officially use the chat box to send your questions. Thanks to that participant who helped me out with this earlier. Okay, so tonight's expert, singular, and here we go, is Dr. Karen Wilson. This is just going so well. Let's see. Here we go. There she is, Dr. Karen Wilson, neuropsychologist, who is a friend of mine and a colleague. Dr. Crystal Lee is unable to join us tonight, so my name is Elizabeth down here at the bottom, and I will be pinch hitting wherever Karen gets exhausted and tired of answering questions. So I am not a psychologist, but I do spend a lot of time around college students with learning disabilities and ADHD, and would certainly be willing to give it a try. So I'm actually now going to back out of these slides in a minute. So we are here to talk about emerging adulthood as a concept, and that is something that both of our experts are very interested in. It comes from Jeffrey Jensen Arnett, and what was interesting is I was just listening to a review of another book by a different author being reviewed by, it's called College Parents Central. There are some women who have a website and a wonderful podcast for parents of college students or students headed to college, College Parents Central. And they were talking about this idea of emerging adulthood. So Arnett had 3 criteria for adulthood. We have accepting responsibility for yourself, making independent decisions, and becoming financially independent. Now, some of our college students will be paying their own way and will be financially independent in that way. Not all of them are, but it's just a good, stepping stone kind of officially on their way to adulthood. And now I'm going to back out of these slides. There we go. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to get us back to our experts. So you can use the chat box to send me questions for our experts. And I'm going to start, Dr. Wilson, with some questions here tonight. So I would say that for a lot, see, I knew I was going to forget this. Too many things. This is why I shouldn't be a one-woman operation. I'm going to launch the poll before we get started. All right, because I do think it's helpful to know who's attending tonight. So who is here tonight? And some of you may be here in dual roles. Parent and guardian, high school professional, psychologist, neuropsychologist, social worker, counselor, transition specialist, counselor, IEC. And if anybody in this group is a tech expert and would like to help me with my next webinar, I'll be taking the application.
You're doing fine.
See, that's why she's such a soothing neuropsychologist. I feel better already. All right, a lot of parents, okay.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
next time I have to remember to ask this question and have it have a setting for are you here at both as professionals and parents.
There's also other, Elizabeth, I'm a college professor, so that's not an option.
I try to make this poll so that it's.
I know it's hard. There's always got to be an other, I guess, for
right. I haven't seen a way to make it so that people could fill in their own, but we'll have to do that. Okay. All right. So looks like 73% are parents. We've got 9% are professionals. We have a psychologist, neuropsychologist, and a social worker, a transition specialist, and 2 IECs. And most of you are here about students starting in the fall. I know this is a very fraught time for this. All right, I'm going to end the poll and we'll share the results. Here we go. Okay, and now I really promise I'm going to move along. All right, Dr. Wilson. So in any year, I think this is a time of year where parents are, you know, feeling excited and anxious for their students. It's a time, I know there's a saying amongst parents of high school seniors that they have to soil the nest before they go. And so sometimes this time is not that much fun. But it's also a historic year in so many ways. And so what are some of the emerging adulthood issues that students will be facing and parents trying to help them will be looking at in any kind of year? Why don't we start with that?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. I really appreciate
Thank you for doing this.
being here tonight and having this discussion about emerging adulthood. I think we can all agree that this is just a very difficult time for a lot of us, and this isn't the transition that we had envisioned. You know, if you think about the parents who are here tonight and the students for that matter, they had kind of this idea of what this period would look like, ending out the senior year, graduation, celebrations, and a lot of that didn't materialize or happen in a different kind of way than we had anticipated. And there's been some sadness around that, right? And there's been some feelings of anxiety associated with that. And there's still a lot of uncertainty at a lot of colleges in terms of what things will look like in the fall. And so I think we have to kind of look at kind of emerging adulthood and this transition to college within the context of a COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one of the things we talked about before everyone came on is the fact that this is really going to be an experiment because it's never been done before, where all of these colleges are trying to figure out how to have these mitigation measures and social distancing, or some colleges have already made the decision to completely do distance learning for the first semester or the first couple of quarters. And so everyone is kind of figuring this whole thing out at the same time. But I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that when we're thinking about emerging adulthood, we're thinking about young people who are really between the ages of about 17, 18, and about 25. And during that period of emerging adulthood, neurodevelopment is still continuing, right? So as a neuropsychologist, I'm kind of looking at that period through that lens of a neuropsychologist. And, you know, we'd like to think that when kids turn 18, they're fully matured and actualized adults, when in fact, and we've had this conversation before, is that brain development continues. And the frontal lobe of the brain actually is the last part of the brain to develop and isn't fully mature until mid-20s. And for students with learning disabilities and ADHD and some other kind of neurodevelopmental challenges, there can be a delay in the development of the frontal lobe as much as 3 years, right? And so as we think about making this transition and preparing students for whatever is ahead and wanting to support them so that they can succeed academically and personally, we have to kind of keep that in mind, that we're not sending an 18-year-old with an 18-year-old frontal lobe to college. We may be sending an 18-year-old with a 15-year-old frontal lobe to college, right? And when we think about it that way, our expectations and how we think about the kinds of support that we want to provide our young people kind of changes, right? And so that's one of the things to keep in mind. I think that one of the things that many parents were kind of thinking about at this time was, you know, going and visiting the college and packing up their young people and bringing them to the campus housing and getting them settled in. And a lot of those things aren't happening right now. And there are a lot of questions that parents need to be asking school administrators in terms of what the fall will look like. And for some schools, they already know, and for some, they're still trying to figure that out. And it really depends on the college, where it is, and where it is located geographically, and the size of the college. You know, for some colleges where they have very large lecture halls with 400 people in a lecture hall, that might not be happening, right? And so there's going to be a shift. And what is that going to look like? That is a classroom that's probably most likely to be transformed to an online class. And for some students, that is not the optimal learning environment for them.
Right. And when we were planning this talk, we talked about some of the things that they won't benefit from that they would ordinarily have in the routine of a college day. Can you talk a little bit about some of those things?
I think one of the things when we again talk about this whole idea of neurodevelopment continuing, one of the things that I think about, particularly when I think about the frontal lobe, I think about executive functioning.
Sure.
And that is important and very important for college students, because college is all about organization and planning and self-awareness and metacognition and being able to inhibit all of those distractors that are going to be in that campus housing room environment. And so they have to manage all of those executive functions in college away from the parental support that they may have had before, right? And so we have to kind of think about that in terms of what it is that they're managing, and really prepare them for that. And when we think about the support that they're going to need, I think about the support that they're going to need is most likely going to fall in that area of executive functioning when they're making that transition. Because one of the things about executive functioning is that the demands for executive functioning increase as we get older. So we think about, as adults, all of the things that we have to manage on any given day, right? Any given day in terms of bills and housework and work and schedules and children and all of these other things, grocery shopping, all of these things. Now students are going to have to assume some of those responsibilities as they transition to college without the benefit of having the support of parents at home or with them. For most students, many students might still actually be at home because of this pandemic situation that we find ourselves in. And so that's going to be a little bit different.
Well, and I think that that's an interesting point too, because when you think about emerging adulthood, and certainly what students were expecting, and unfortunately what some of them are going to experience, and there's been a lot of articles I've been looking at this spring about the tension, and again, College Parents Central had a good one on, you know, now your college kid is home, or in the case of the student who thought, you know, they were finally going to get out and be on their own, they're going to not have that opportunity. And so, you know, what are some ways that parents too can, you know, the executive functions are still going to need to develop, right?
Right.
So how can parents sort of structure that, especially, I mean, I like to think, even though students may not appreciate this, there's a little bit of benefit of this, given what you just told us about, you know, neurodevelopment, and the fact that these kids with LD and ADHD are behind developmentally, maturity-wise a little bit. So there's a little bit extra cushion time, right? So how can the parents both, you know, let students feel like they're making their own decisions, but guide that executive functioning?
Right. And I think one of the things that you had asked about too was this, what the university system kind of provides to students who have weaknesses in executive functioning. I think one of the benefits of being on campus is that you have a built-in structure at a university system. I think that's one of the things that we talked about.
Yeah.
That you're living in student housing, you're kind of cued by your peers who are getting ready to leave for their classes as well. And you have the structure of the campus, you have the dining hall, and you have the student union in between classes, and you have a set time for your classes to occur, and you kind of follow that schedule. And so there's a built-in structure when you're living on campus, because all the people that you're kind of surrounded by are kind of doing the same thing. And so if students are going to be at home and trying to engage in the campus experience as a university student from home, it's going to be very different, because they are not going to have the structure of a college campus to kind of help support the executive functioning that is still developing. And I think one thing to keep in mind when we think about executive functioning and thinking about brain development is that brain development during this period of emerging adulthood, what we're doing is we're increasing independence and we're increasing responsibility. But those two things are developing in the context of parental and societal support. And so that's something really to keep in mind, is that it is okay to continue to support our young people as they're developing these executive functioning skills, as they're making the transition to college. We're not going to be over-parenting, but we are going to be there for support and even sometimes structure some of the things that students will need to support them in order for them to be successful. And that can look very different. I know one of the things you said was, how can we do that? And I think it looks different in different families because students are struggling in different ways. It's one of the reasons why we have, in the public school system, we have individualized education plans, right? We don't have one plan for all kids with dyslexia or one plan for all kids with ADHD. It's really individualized. And we have to keep that in mind, that every student will have their own unique strengths and their own unique needs. And we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to decide what type of support they will need. And one of the things I tell parents was, as they're getting ready to make this transition to college, their students are getting ready to make this transition to college, is to reread that last psychoeducational or neuropsychological assessment report. What was in there in terms of the accommodations, the modifications, the recommendations for supporting your child. In that report should also have been an outline of your child's strengths, because we want to make sure that we know what those strengths are and the student knows what those strengths are as they're getting ready to transition to college. I can't tell you how many students have never read their neuropsychological assessment report.
Oh, you're singing my song.
Or who've never read their they don't know what's in there. Their parents have kind of set up the assessment and they've come in and they've had the feedback with the clinician afterward, and they've kind of gone over the strengths and weaknesses in that 30-minute to an hour-long session, but they've never read the report. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's a mistake. I think the students need to know what's in there, because in there is outlined very clearly not only what they need in terms of support, but why they need it.
It's almost like I fed you these lines to say back out. Exactly, because those of you who know me from social media and all my work too know that I've been beating the drum about getting your students to register with the Disability Services Office right now. Today is a great, well, it's laid out here on the East Coast, but tomorrow is a great day for them to do that. And this all ties in with what Dr. Wilson is saying, in that they need to know what their strengths are, in part because that should drive the way that they study and the way that they prepare. And they do need to know their weaknesses, and not because we want to pat them on the head and say, oh yes, you poor dear, and this is what you're not good at, but so that they know where they need the support, what they maybe shouldn't be doing when it comes to approaching their work. And when they go to register with our office, at a lot of schools, the registration form is going to say, what accommodations are you requesting and why do you need them? And the answer can't just be, I have a 1.7 standard deviations between my broad reading skill and my cognitive ability. There needs to be a true understanding of that. So I think that that's such an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other point that you made is really important, is about reaching out to those resource offices, whether it be a learning center. I know they have different names at different colleges, a learning center, students with disabilities office, to reach out to them early to establish what accommodations and what resources are available, services are available for students at the college level, because it might be different than what they have received in high school. And if they're going to need additional support that the school does not provide, then you want to make sure that you're having opportunities to provide that support for them, whether that be an external person or external service who will also provide support. It might be, for example, executive functioning coaching, for example, something like that, that might not be offered through a learning disabilities office or a learning center. And that might be something you might want to arrange if executive functioning is a significant area of weakness for your child.
Well, and I'm imagining there are some parents thinking, well, you know, if kiddo's going to be home for the fall, I could probably do that, right? What could possibly go wrong? You
I
think
think
that's
again,
a good idea?
we have to think about, we want them to emerge as more independent. So we don't want to use this opportunity for them being at home due to a pandemic to continue what it is that we have been doing as they were high school students, right? So we want to be able to kind of let them go and again, provide support as needed, but they have to develop that responsibility and that independence. And it's going to be occurring in a different way than it would have materialized if they were on campus, but they still have to have the opportunity to do that.
Well, and I think, you know, again, back to the idea of emerging adulthood and making decisions for yourself, I'm sure that there are a lot of students thinking, well, I am living at home, but I'm going to decide what time I get up. And, you know, I imagine there's going to be some tension between parents who get up at a very early hour to get to work, get younger siblings out, and now college students who, while not in that environment, feel like they're ready for the next thing. And so, you know, maybe it doesn't matter if you sleep till noon if class is until 1. But what can parents do? So they're observing their child, their young adult living at home and, you know, doing this schooling. How can they approach suggesting some improvements to the executive functioning? Perhaps, you know, students who are sleeping through the class or getting there late, or if they observe their student perhaps, you know, attending class while also attending to something over here. Are there ways that you would recommend that parents try to nudge them along?
I think it begins with really having the students become empowered. And the more steps that they can take to advocate for themselves, I think that is kind of the direction that you'd want to go. And I think parents have to be careful about nagging because you see students doing something that you don't approve of. And so one of the things I would start with, instead of kind of anticipating them experiencing struggles, is to help them to be proactive at this stage, right? After they read their report, have a discussion with them in terms of what kinds of supports do you think you will continue to need in college, right? What do you think what was most beneficial to you in terms of your accommodations when you're in high school? And what are the kinds of support do you think that you feel that you will need moving forward in college, in a college environment? And they should be the ones reaching out to the Learning Disabilities Office and the learning centers, not the parents, because we want to help them advocate for themselves. And they are the ones who are going to have that relationship with those officers and with the university. And so we want them to step into that independent role. And one of the things that I get a lot of delight from is when students call me to schedule their reassessment or their reevaluation. Wow. And not their parents.
Yeah.
And these are students who I may have evaluated, you know, when they entered high school, and now they need updated testing for college. And when they reach out to me via email or with a phone call, I know that the parents are really allowing that independence to occur, rather than continuing to take on the responsibility of scheduling the appointment and doing all of those things for them, because this is the time to help them develop those independent skills. And so having them make the call, having them set up the time with the counselor to determine what resources are going to be available to them at the university is going to be helpful. And I think at this time, what's even more critical is that a lot of students don't know what accommodations will look like if they are going to be going through this academic process, this first semester, this first quarter, via distance learning, right? What does that look like? What do accommodations look like when you are not in a classroom, when you're learning virtually? And so these are the questions that have to be asked in terms of testing and time tests. And what does that look like? What are my accommodations going to look like if I am learning in this manner? And those are the answers that you want to have.
Well, and once again, you've teed me up perfectly. So I am trying, forgive me folks, I'm trying to check the chat, listen to Dr. Wilson, make some notes too. So I think that the point about making your own appointments, that's the kind of stuff they can start doing now. So for instance, before they go to college, they got to see the pediatrician, they got to get the health form filled out, make sure they get their 15 different shots if they're going back, all that kind of stuff. These are perfect opportunities.
Yeah.
And, you know, even though it's summer and it's not, a lot of students I know don't have summer jobs, it's a rough time to do a lot of this stuff, but I think you could still, you know, set some weekly goals, and students should be involved in what those goals are. It can be things like finishing the paperwork, you know, making the shopping list. I mean, again, as I'm talking, I'm hearing myself, and then the voice in my back, the back of my head is saying, "Oh, but they're not shopping if they're not going to campus." So there are a lot of opportunities we might have used previously to do this stuff. And what you said about contacting the Disability Services Office. So for those who don't know, there is, I'm an admin in a Facebook group for parents just like you. And at this time of year, there's a lot of, you know, can I call the office for my student? Is it okay if I attend the meeting? And so a lot of my colleagues, and I can see there's somebody on this call tonight who works at a college. When I've interviewed disability services directors for my book, they have said, you know, a lot of them don't mind if a parent attends, but they really do want to hear from the student, because they need to know also what the student's level of awareness is, as Dr. Wilson has said. And so I think what's really important about that too is you can prepare them. It's not a quiz to go in for that meeting. It's okay to have notes. It's okay to refer to your report if you want to, but you can prepare them for that. And so going through the registration form with them is a really good way of finding out what they know and what they need to know. And then getting them, you know, whoever the professional is that you've worked with to get that information. I understand we have students with language-based learning disabilities, and that makes it a challenge. You have social difficulties, and that makes it a challenge. But you can prepare them, and again, it's not a test. They can come with their notes, and actually that would probably really impress the disability services person if they came prepared for that meeting with notes. I am going to put out a call. I know Kelly Schmidt is on this, and you had mentioned not nagging. Kelly, if you would not mind, if you're still on the call, you had posted a link the other day from Attitude magazine about how not to nag your kids. So my mind is always exploding with stuff I've come across. And if you can put that in the chat box, and if not, I will make myself a note to put it in the resources when I send it to everybody tomorrow.
And Elizabeth, I think one of the things that parents can do, you know, if they've observed some things, you don't want to nag and say, shouldn't you be getting up earlier? You know, shouldn't you get a snack right now? Because think about whether you would have the opportunity to intervene if they were on campus, right? And so kind of think about it that way, but it's okay to check in with them, you know, at the end of their first week, at the end of their first couple of weeks, and say, you know, how's it going? What's working? What's not working? Have you learned anything? Because then it might come up that, you know, I find that I work better late at night, and that's why I'm getting up late and later in the morning, right? Or I need to be an early bird and get things done earlier because my mind is clearer during that time. And so by asking questions rather than nagging, you help the young person find the answers themselves in terms of what's working and what's not working, and asking, do you need support in any areas? Is there anything that we can do to help you in areas where you're struggling? What do you think would be helpful? And brainstorm together rather than imposing what you think would be helpful for them as they're developing that independence and responsibility.
If you have a student that you don't think has that level of self-awareness, you know, you sit down and you say, how are things going? And they say, that's great. I think it's going great. You know, is it okay to offer, you know, what you're observing? Is it better to just sort of let it, you know, I think it's not every, or what if the student says, you know what, I mean, I don't know what I don't know. It seems all right. It's my first time, right?
Right. It is. I think it is okay, and I think you want to ask as many questions that you can, even if there seems to be kind of limited insight, because insight is something that is also developing, right? And you want to, again, provide some support. So having a structure, helping them with specific tasks. One of the things I can think of that's really helpful is for parents to be aware of the add drop dates for classes, right? So for example, when students register for classes, there's a date where they can take classes and then they can drop it without it showing up on their transcript, right? And so a student, for example, with working memory difficulties may not remember when that date is. So it's okay for parents to have that date in mind and to be able to say, you know, you took 5 classes this semester, and that's a lot of classes. And I see the deadline is approaching for the add drop date. I don't know if you remember that is the date where you can drop a class without being penalized and without it showing up on your transcript. How are you with managing that load right now? Right? And so you're checking in with them, and that way they are kind of helping them to be more self-aware in terms of saying, you know what, these 4 classes are going well, but this one is really tough. I think it's too much. I feel a little overwhelmed with 5. 4 would be better. And that might be helpful for them in making that determination. And maybe it's time I should drop that class before that deadline. So they may need some reminders, but again, you want to have it elicit a conversation as opposed to, again, imposing what it is that they should do. You don't want to say, I think you should drop 3 of your classes, right?
Right.
So you can have a discussion about it.
Right, and things that they can do are get into, you know, their course management system, see what their grades look like. I'm so glad that you mentioned the idea of course load. I would say that, you know, and in my writing, I say this all the time, transition to college is a challenge for most people. It is a real change to the environment. It's changed to the level of support and structure. And so students with ADHD, and in some of the studies that I've read on college students, they actually are the ones who tend to think that things are going well without a sense that they are not. And so just, you know, saying, look, you really need to just start with the minimum to get started is such a good idea. They can always pick up a summer course or a winter course or something, but, you know, we want to set them up for success. And in fairness to them, they have no idea what 4 courses in college looks like. And they go like, oh, I took 5 or 6 classes in high school. I could certainly do that at the college level, right? No big deal. Right. So, you know, that might be a place where you do want to insist a little bit, or just say, look, you know, if you think this is something you can do, you can start at 5, but like, let's set a date at which, as you say, even before the add drop level date. And it is hard because I know that for financial aid, I'm on a scholarship fund here, and in our community college, they only have a week to decide whether they're dropping stuff. And so sometimes the class is only met once.
Right.
And that is a challenge, but it's, you know, these are real big, you know, they want the independence. And as I always say in my presentations, with freedom comes responsibility.
Yes.
And so that's the part we have to remind them of.
That's where I think being proactive is so helpful. So again, kind of going back to reaching out to disability offices, learning centers now, like you were saying, you know, tomorrow, to find out, you know, what is the best schedule for my child, and helping them to come to that determination on their own, given their strengths, given their areas of weakness. Perhaps going full-time is not the best thing to do if they're going to have to take all their classes remotely. So these are the kinds of discussions that they can be having with those learning centers right now, in terms of what would be the best approach for them right now, given the mode of learning that is going to take place. And it's going to be different from college to college, like I said. Some colleges might be doing face-to-face with mitigation measures. Some will be a hybrid approach. Some will be completely distance learning. And what we know is that not everyone can learn via a distance learning, you know, curriculum. It can be tough for a lot of students who aren't sitting in a classroom and picking up on the nonverbal cues and having a discussion and being engaged. The engagement is different than it is via Zoom versus in class. And that can be a challenge for a lot of students, and particularly those who have attention issues.
I think that that's important, and it's interesting because in the groups that I'm on online, I'm seeing some families saying that actually students are doing better, they're less anxious about being, so it's definitely a mix of things, but I think, you know, it's all of that stuff that they're missing, like you said. If they're going to be online, you know, they're not really getting to know their peers, they're not making, it's going to be harder to find a study buddy, if you will.
Right.
You know, to find somebody to get the notes if you're absent. There are just a lot of challenges. So in fact, I see a comment here. So I'm going to turn
Sure.
to the chat. So folks, we've got a little while left if you want to put some questions in here.
One of the, while you're kind of reviewing the chat,
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I do want to say too that there's so much of a focus on kind of what instruction will look like, hybrid, distance, face-to-face. But we have to also keep in mind that we have to be attuned to the social and emotional experience of young people who are going to be transitioning, even if that transition takes place while they're still at home. Mm-hmm. Because emerging adulthood is also a very vulnerable time from an emotional point of view. Right. And for students with ADHD and dyslexia, they are at greater risk for depression and anxiety than their peers who do not have neurodevelopmental differences. And so we have to be mindful, and when we're thinking about checking in with, parents are thinking about checking in with their children, really checking in and observing their social and emotional well-being. Because now more than ever, it's important for students to take care of their emotional health, because it's very hard to learn if you're anxious and depressed and worried and stressed and fearful. And so you can't even think about the accommodations and modifications that you're going to need in school if you've got this kind of blanket of anxiety and worry that is weighing on you as you're making this transition. So while we're looking at the support that students are going to need academically, whether that be extended time, alternative testing, note-taking, text-to-speech software, we have to also look at the emotional and social support that they will need, whether there's a therapist that they can check in with, if there's a lot of anxiety and worry or fear about, you know, what this looks like if they are doing face-to-face classes, or anxiety about doing their whole first semester, first quarter via distance learning. So we have to make sure they're getting the social and emotional support in addition to the academic support.
That's so important.
I wanted to make sure I said that.
No, and I'm so glad you did, because I know we did talk about that ahead of time. I mean, and so do you have, I mean, just obviously if students are, well, let me back up. So if students are actually going to go to campus, mm-hmm. It certainly doesn't mean they're going to be immune from, you know, the impact of this. What are things that if kids are not in the house, they're at college, should parents be paying attention to if there are actually phone calls or texts or whatever? What are the signs that the student might be really struggling with anxiety or depression, and prompt the parent to prompt the student to go to the counseling center?
I think if you notice a change in their demeanor and their behavior and the things that they're saying, you know, I just can't get up in the morning, I'm feeling really sad, or I'm not motivated. There's a loss of interest in doing things that they would normally do. They had all these great things that they had planned to do, and now they don't want to do any of those things. If they're worried, or they're nervous, or they're, you know, seem more withdrawn, then those are kind of red flags where you want to check in with them to make sure that they're okay, and to discuss with them about getting additional support, psychological support. And that's available to students at the university. I'm sure that they're going to make, you know, telehealth available to students who are not on campus, and to make sure the students are aware that that's available and how to access those resources when they need to.
For those who have not had a college student go yet, be aware that counseling generally on campus, they'll usually allow students to see somebody, and I'm just going on the experience of where I have worked in the past, every 2 weeks. and generally just for a certain amount of time before they will refer a student off campus. So, there aren't a lot of campuses I'm aware of that can provide, weekly therapy. And so if that's something you're working with now, you should find out whether your student's therapist is allowed to, with licensing restrictions, work remotely. I'm guessing things are different. You'd be the one to ask, Dr. Wilson, different right now than they have been in the past. Are things easier?
Well, you still have to be in the same state as your therapist,
Okay.
right? And so, or your therapist has to be licensed in that state. So these are things to kind of keep in mind. So if a student has a therapist right now, those are the things, again, that student should be discussing with his or her therapist about continuing treatment or helping them transition to a new therapist as they transition to university life.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, that continuity can be a really good lifeline for students. And I think too, just parents do, if they have questions now about what mental health looks like on campus, mental health services, now is the time to ask. So you've got some time to arrange for that.
Absolutely.
All right, let me see what this, okay. So we have somebody talking about the added burden for freshmen, let's see, of even just keeping track of, are you in person, are you hybrid, are you on campus and taking classes. Students will be in masks and teachers will be too. I would imagine we're going to see a lot more anxious students than we've ever seen.
I think so too. And that might be something, again, a conversation to have with the health center at the university. Are they going to be increasing the level of social and emotional support to students given this pandemic that we're in, right?
Right.
So conversations and questions to ask as well.
It's going to be brand new for everybody, I guess. Well, let's see, this says, can you address the kinds of accommodations staff students might receive from a college so they can advocate for themselves? I need help because my son tends to put things off us until a crisis point.
And that again speaks to being proactive, right? If you're registering with the disabilities office or the learning center ahead of time, then you're already putting in place what the accommodations are that you will need, right? And that's another reason to revisit that last evaluation report, what was recommended, meeting with the school, the high school, or speaking with the high school guidance counselor to see what accommodations was the student utilizing in high school.
Right.
And having a discussion with the student about, will you continue to need those accommodations in college, right?
Right.
And which of those accommodations will you need? And again, when we first sat down, we said that the accommodations are going to be different from student to student, depending on what it is that they've had in the past. And so again, revisiting the report and seeing what did that look like? Was it time and a half on tests? Was it a private room for testing? Well, what does a private room look like when you're doing tests online, right? What does extended time look like? If there's alternative testing, so instead of multiple choice, a student might be permitted to do essays or reports. So these are the kinds of things you have to inquire about, because it's going to be different from student to student and from disability office to disability office in terms of what is available. Even foreign language waivers, things like that. These are all things that students need to be asking about to see what it is that they need, what they qualify for based on their documented history of a learning disorder.
So in the handouts tomorrow in the resources, I will send out a list of accommodations that, excuse me, some stuff I've written for Understood about accommodations that are common. And I also just, is that up yet? I just did something for Attitude on how things are going to work in the fall as far as we know, because nobody really knows anything yet. And if you follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, I've written something for the National Center for LD, where I interviewed a disability services director friend of mine, and she has, I think they're going to do it as a series. She talks about the accommodations and how they work. So as Dr. Wilson said, how does, obviously, if you're supposed to get a room with reduced distraction for your test, and you're going to be taking your tests at home because that's where you're getting educated. There isn't that much the school can do, but one of the things you can do is ask, do they have noise canceling headphones? Could they ship them to you and loan them to you? Are you allowed to use them? Or can you go to, Lowe's and buy the foam ones that people use for using their chainsaws or whatever? Those are ways. So I think, we're going to have to be a little bit adaptive about that stuff. So I've seen some things from colleagues where students now might have 24 hours to take a test instead of, the 2 hours or 3 hours you might have in an in-class setting. And so it may be possible for students in that scenario to take their test at night when everybody's, watching TV or quiet, or in the morning if they get up before everybody's up. Let's see. Yep, we still don't know what it's going to look like in the fall for sure. Is it possible oh, this is a great question. Is it possible to add a new accommodation after the semester starts?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think it would depend on the disability office and can you document the need for it? Is that right, Elizabeth?
Yes, so I'll pick this one up. So the answer is yes, you can always ask, and that's, by the way, in COVID or non-COVID times. We, expect students to come to college understanding what they need. We understand that needs change based on setting. We also understand that none of us knows, again, as I said earlier, what it's like to be in college until we get to college. And so, sure, students can certainly do that. They probably, they may have to fill out another form. It might be as simple as an email. And with any accommodation that they're going to request, the disability services staff just needs to see a connection between what they are asking for and what their actual area of functional weaknesses. And those words sound harsh, but a disability is, according to the law, a substantial limitation in an area of functioning. And so it has to make sense. And as Dr. Wilson said, even, within areas of disability, dyslexia, ADHD, anxiety disorders, everybody's an individual and experiences different symptoms to varying degrees. And so that is what the documentation needs to demonstrate, and students, should be able to articulate. So short answer to that question is yes, you can always ask for another accommodation. You can ask, and I wanted to return to the question about, so the question about, do we provide supports? I'm not sure I'm reading this quite correctly or interpreting it correctly, about the son who puts things off. Colleges don't tend to do anything specific to help students advocate for themselves. Basically, they register with us, and depending upon how the school does this, and I've heard about all different models, sometimes the student then gets a letter, what we call an LOA, letter of accommodation, that they're supposed to deliver to their professors that outlines what we've approved for them. Sometimes it's an email. Sometimes the course management system has that information, and I get my approved accommodation. My professor, Dr. Wilson, gets an email, I guess, that says, hey, some student in your class, and she logs in the secure system and sees what my accommodations are. So it will vary from place to place. They will, if the student wants to practice what they would say to a professor, I'm sure disability services would be willing to give them the time to do that. But as far as the last minute piece, what I always recommend, and the reason I'm pushing now for students to register, is once they register with us, if they've finished the process, the accommodations are approved, they never have to use them. So it's what I call a free insurance policy. They're there if you need them and not if you don't. So one thing I do want to bring up to people is some students really have never had like a conscious experience of having accommodations. Sometimes in high school, the class gets the whole period to take a test, and half of them finish in 20 minutes, and then they look at their phones for the next 20, and then the students who have extra time will just use that time to do it. So they may not be so aware of the fact that they've had it until they take the SAT or the ACT, And that, the extended time accommodation, is you're locked in that room with everybody for 4 hours, and you can't read your phone, you can't read a book, you can't do anything but stare at your fingernails for 4 hours. And so one of the things that they need to know is that that's not how it works at college. When you're done with your exam, off you go. So make sure you deliberately, explicitly tell them that. Tell them that we don't send a list to all the faculty and staff members of the college at the start of every term that says, here are all the students who register with us. The only people who need to know about their accommodations are the ones who need to be involved with their accommodations. Right. So try to sell it to them, and I will send you guys that link on. I have a page on my website that is speaking directly to students why you should register with Disability Services, and there's a page on the parent side for talking points to use about this. So, you know, you can just try to get them to register with us. Now, as far as taking exams, at least where I have worked, students generally have to fill out a form 2 weeks before their exam that says, here's the exam I'm taking, here's the professor. And the reason we need this stuff is that the office then has to contact Dr. Wilson and say, Elizabeth is taking your exam. And that means Dr. Wilson can't make it up while she has her breakfast the morning of the exam. She's got to send it to us so we can get it when in the places where this is happening to the room where the accommodations will happen. If it's going to be online, there are settings, I understand, in the course management system where the professor sets the extended time. That has to be done in advance. So all of your student will still have some bits of responsibility toward those accommodations, but getting the bulk of this registration process done now is one way to kind of move that self-advocacy a little bit. So I hope that answers MB's question a little bit. Okay, let's see. Can you recommend any good executive function apps or resources for student use? Do you have any suggestions for phone apps or resources that help students track assignments and class deadlines, especially for a student who is resistant to filling in traditional calendar even on the phone? Okay, do you have anything? And I'm going to ask Kelly again. Sorry, she's going to be my pinch hitter tonight. Kelly, if you've got any apps, I know Kelly works with college students. Put them in the chat box, Kelly.
It's, I mean, a lot. I've worked with a lot of students who like Google Calendar and have had a lot of success with that. I would see if they can meet with, a lot of students meet with college counselors, and they help them to kind of put all the things, the classes in their calendar ahead of time. So if they can even if they're not going to check their Google Calendar, if they can have a date where they put all their classes in, the start date, the times, and the end dates, at least it is there. And if you can, then they will know it. Even if they're not checking every week, when they do check, it will be there. So it's not something that they have to input every day. Every week they would have to input what classes they're going to take next week. But at least if they have all of their classes on their schedule at the beginning of the academic year, it's there. There's a lot of apps that sync with Google Calendar, Zoom meetings, things like that. If classes are going to be held via Zoom, that app connects with Google Calendar. There's also a great app for note taking. Notability is a really good app where students can, you know, record lessons and then take notes at the same time. And that's also been helpful for students. I think one thing to keep in mind too is if students are going to be looking at lectures on a screen, if they also have the accommodation for typing in their notes or using a laptop, it's going to be very hard to use the same device to take your notes and watch the lecture, because then you're going to have to minimize the instructor in the corner and then have a Word document open. So this is something they may have to be thinking about in terms of if they're going to be watching a class online, they may need a desktop and a laptop, or an iPad with a keyboard where they can take notes and watch the lecture. So these are things they might not have been thinking about because they were expecting to have in face-to-face lessons and be able to bring in a laptop and take notes. That's going to be different if they are watching the lecture on their computer And so these are things that they need to be thinking about.
So that's really interesting, because that is not something in my discussion with my disability services director friend that came up. What she was actually saying was that for students who've been accommodated in the past, where they've needed to have permission to use a laptop for note taking, that is no longer a point if they're taking classes remotely. But we didn't discuss what happens if they're doing that. So yeah, I think it's certainly interesting. And I think too, you know, I think a little bit of peer pressure, if you're sitting in a lecture and everybody else is paying attention, there's a little bit more impetus to kind of stay on task, keep your phone put away. Now you're going to be at home, maybe in your pajamas, and I'm not here to judge that, but I think there's a little bit less. So I have to say, I fidgeted so much, I don't know what I did with it, but I personally, I bought the fidget cube when they first came out so I could show them to my students. And I sit here for so long, that I end up, fiddling with it too, just to make sure that I can keep myself focused, because these are long days. I think it's really, for students with ADHD particularly, I think this environment maybe has some advantages because you're not paying attention to other students and what they're doing in the class, and maybe for some with anxiety disorders, this is going to be easier. But I don't know, this Zoom world we're living in, this thing has got a lot of use.
Right. And I think that's where they have to incorporate self-care into what it is that they're going to be doing during the academic year. Because if you think about being on campus, you get to sit in a lecture hall and then walk across campus, sit on the yard, get some fresh air. And now they're sitting in their room with Zoom calls or Zoom lessons. And so they have to kind of think about how are they going to get that experience of the fresh air, of walking around, because it's going to be very easy to be sedentary, right? And so these are things that you can start brainstorming with them in terms of what they can do in between classes. It might be, taking a walk, going for a bike ride, and then coming back to the computer, because that rather than being at a computer and then checking their social media and then being on the computer again, because then they're just sitting at a computer all day, right?
Guilty. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So somebody has said that they can split screen on one device to take notes and watch the lecture, but and use a second monitor if that's something that your family can do. Kelly has been kind enough to find an Attitude Mag link with at Time Tools and Management. I know one of my students that I work with likes something called Wunderlist. I mean, one thing I'll caution about, because I've seen students do this over the years, they spend so much time trying to find the perfect app that they never get any work done. The planner shopping, holy cow. I mean, you can spend hours online looking for exactly the perfect planner. So if your student's going to do that, I would say have them try one for, 2 weeks before they decide to abandon that. They have to actually use it. Downloading it is great, but you have to actually enter all your stuff. What was I just thinking about? We're talking about apps and planners and time management. I mean, you can also get them working on time management right now, starting the week, giving them certain tasks to complete, or making it, I'm sorry, did I say giving them? Talking to them about goals that they have. And setting out and kind of working with them, like, okay, when is this going to get done? Are you going to use a pop-up reminder on your phone? How are you going to make sure that you get that done? And, having a little bit of a check-in with them and making it once a week, just to, start to get to the idea that maybe they're going to leave everything till the last minute. It is possible to survive that way, but how do you feel about doing that? Did you like giving up your weekend because I told you had to clean out the garage and you didn't get it done all week long? So there are little ways that we can work on this stuff. So
and I would also encourage them to join study groups, because then their accountability comes from their peers rather than from their parent.
I think that's a great idea
as well. And then also to join clubs and groups, even if they're going to be initially meeting remotely. It's a way to stay connected And we know that social support acts as a buffer to anxiety and depression and loneliness. It decreases loneliness. So the extent to which they can be involved and connect with their peers and find ways to join clubs or join groups or connect to initiatives that they feel passionate about, that is important as well.
That's such a good point. I think, you know, it's going to take a little bit more effort for those who are working remotely, but it's really important. So let me just mute that. Okay. So anyway, we're going to end it for tonight. So I will be sending you all the link tomorrow to this recorded chat. You can share it. Oh, I know what I was thinking about. With regard to apps, if you go to my YouTube channel, and that'll be in the email tomorrow, you can view a chat that some other friends of mine have done on assistive technology, and I know that there's a list of apps there. I will try to remember to send you that list too with the handouts tomorrow. So let me just go back. Let's see how I do. Share, here we go. So in your handouts too will be Dr. Wilson's information, and even though Dr. Lee, if that is your, there we go. Sorry, just want to mute that speaker. So Dr. Lee has a great blog, and she has done some work on emerging adulthood, so you may want to check that out and connect with her too. So coming up, so it's going to go a little quiet for the next couple of weeks, but I am doing a mini series for the LDA of America. In August, I'm going to be doing the College Disability Services System, students' responsibilities and rights, and what the accommodations are. And on the 26th, I will be doing college accommodations, why they change, and what is commonly available or not. And in September, a friend of mine who does college advising for students with LD and ADHD, she was the head of the LD Special Interest Group, I think it was called, for the IECA, will be doing a talk for me. And so we haven't set that time yet. But again, if you follow me or just shoot me an email at any time, I can get you that date once I have it. For more information, I have done a chat about that might answer some of your questions about college accommodations and transition. That's on the YouTube channel. I have friends who had done one on gap considerations for students. There's the screen for my friends who did the assistive tech, and there was one on college readiness as well. Go to my website too, and I'm offering a special discount on my book for anybody who's interested. Just email me and view the other chats. So thank you all for joining me. My apologies for the technical problems. It's always something new every time. But thank you very much to Dr. Wilson for offering us her expertise and her time tonight.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. Good night, everybody. Have a good one. Thanks.
Okay. Good night.